So the general question here in this reading is whether there can actually be a categorical imperative. And that's something that you should understand just from me saying it, categorical imperative. Categorical as opposed to hypothetical. Those things have been explained as much as I can explain them in previous videos. Can there actually be a categorical imperative? And he goes back to his, really the first version of it here at the bottom of page 1. The question then is it a necessary law for all rational beings that they should always judge of their actions by maxims of which they can themselves will, that they should serve as universal laws? Is a categorical imperative possible? And I think that the way that he approaches that question is here. I guess we're on page 2. Well, okay. Let's think about the human will. He says the will is conceived as a faculty of determining oneself to action in accordance with the conception of certain laws. That is, we as human beings, we as rational beings, have the capacity to act not just from impulse or desire, but to act in accordance with our conception of certain laws. It may be that we're in a store and we have no money and we have a real desire for an object there. We have the opportunity to steal it, to shoplift, and every sort of impulse and desire is pushing us to just take the thing. But as rational creatures, we have the capacity to act, to determine our actions with the conception of certain laws. So we don't necessarily take the thing. We may not take it because it's not in accordance with that law that we can conceive. And so he says, and such a faculty can be found only in rational beings. Now, that which serves the will as the objective ground of its self-determination is the end. It's very Aristotelian. That which determines the will is the end. What is it that is our purpose, our goal, just like Aristotle said. And if this is assigned by reason alone, it must hold for all rational beings. That is there an end or purpose that is set by reason alone and not by any of my human propensities, which are, after all, just part of my human nature and could be different? On the other hand, that which merely contains the ground of possibility of the action, of which the effect is the end, this is called the means. The subjective ground of the desire is the spring. That is, on the objective side is the thing to be accomplished, the end. On the subjective side is the desire. I am the subject. I have the desire. The objective ground of the volition is the motive. I'm not sure what he means by that. Hence, the distinction between subjective ends, which rest on springs, and objective ends, which depend on motives, valid for every rational being. So on the one hand, we have things which are good because they respond to or correspond to what we want, our desires. Those would be subjective ends. If I'm hungry, the hamburger is a subjective end for me. I want it. It has value for me because I'm hungry. If I'm not hungry, or if I'm sick to my stomach, the hamburger has no value for me. It has no value. Its value disappears. And that tells me that the hamburger is not inherently valuable. It's not an end in itself. It's valuable because I value it. And if I stop valuing it, it has no value. That would be things that were subjective ends. But objective ends would be things that would be valuable in themselves. So he says, an objective ends, which depend on motives, valid for every rational being. So if we can think of some things which are goods because people happen to value them, those are subjective ends. If we can think of something which would be recognized as good by every rational creature, no matter their circumstances, that would be an objective end. And that's what he thinks would be the basis for a categorical imperative. imperative. That is, if there has to be something in the world which we all recognize to be an end, something we value, something that has value for us, but it has nothing to do with our feelings, our desires at all. If there is such a thing, then there's a basis for the categorical imperative, because we would all recognize that we had a duty to that thing. If there's not such a thing, then there's no categorical imperative, and Kant's whole idea of morality would fall apart. Continues and says, practical principles are formal when they abstract from all subjective ends. They are material when they assume these, and therefore particular springs of action. The ends which a rational being proposes to himself at pleasure as effects of his actions, material ends, are all only relative, for it is only their relation to the particular desires of the subject that gives them worth. So, there's things that we want in the world, and we know that we want them because we have particular desires. But is there another thing that we want or desire or value that does not depend on our desires? That's really the question. So at the bottom of the page here, we see this. Supposing, however, that there were something whose existence has in itself an absolute worth, something which, being an end in itself, could be a source of definite laws, then in this and this alone would lie the source of a possible categorical imperative, that is, a practical law. So I think that what Kant's moral philosophy boils down to, at this point at least, is the question about whether there is anything in the world that you and I intuitively recognize has absolute intrinsic worth, that has value not because we value it because of our desires, that we recognize that has value no matter what. That's not like the hamburger. Okay, that has subjective worth. We realize that its worth depends upon me valuing it or somebody valuing it. And if no one valued it, if no one actually felt, wanted it, it would have no worth at all. The question is everything like that? Is everything a subjective value? Is everything that have worth, is it subjective worth? Or is there anything in the world which is intrinsically worthy, where I must, no matter what my feelings, recognize this thing has value and always has value, and therefore I have a duty to it? That's the real question. Oh, and there's an answer. We'll go through it in the next video. But here it is. When he says, now I say man, and he means human being. It's unfortunate that, that's not maybe clear anymore, but when he says man, he means mankind, human beings. So I'll just change it. Now I say human beings, and generally any rational being exists as an end in itself. So we'll look at that next time or in the next video, but that's the answer. There is something in the world that is intrinsically worthy, whose worth does not depend on anybody valuing it, but is intrinsic value, and that is a human being.